Thank you everyone for joining. It's not a sunny afternoon here in DC. It's a little bit gloomy, which makes it easier to spend our time in front of a screen looking at each other's beautiful faces. My name is Amira El-Gawly. I am the founder and CEO of a workplace culture agency called Manifesta, based here in Washington, DC. We're a proud sponsor of DC Startup Week this year, as well as the curator of the first ever culture track. DC Startup Week is a 5-day conference every September. This is the first time we go virtual. It's been an incredible week so far. DC, bless you, Jess. DC Startup Week is focused on building up the startup community and serving entrepreneurs here in our area. We want to give a quick shout out to our title sponsors, Next, Insperity, WIS, and Technology Rivers. Thank you so much for your support and helping to make this event happen. So for our audience, we hope you will engage with us throughout the session. I look forward to a lively chat. We had a really lively chat in our last session about remote work. Feel free to talk to each other, +1 things, shout out our speakers, get to know each other. And at the end of the session, we'll be taking questions. So anytime you think of a question you want to ask our panel, just go ahead and write the word question, and then your question. I'll model it for you in a moment. So for those of you who want to share on social, really quickly, tag DC Startup Week, tag us at Manifesta Co. And I will share more with you about this guide later. So that being said, I will hand it over to Rachel, Jessica, and Pothik to introduce themselves. And once you introduce yourselves, we'll then do a little meditation, all of us together.
Thank you, Amira. Thank you for the warm introduction. And we are going to do something a little bit different for intros today in the spirit of mental health and normalizing mental health. We'll start off with our typical intro, and then I've asked our lovely panelists, and they have agreed to share what they're comfortable with in terms of their own personal journey and why this topic is so important to them. So without further ado, I'll start with you, Jessica, hand it over to you for an intro, turn to Pothik, and then I'll share a bit about myself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you so much, Amira, for coordinating this. My name is Jessica. I'm the Director of Innovation at the American Psychological Association, which is based in DC, although I'm quarantining right now in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is otherwise known as Amish country, so it's nice and beautiful here. I'm an expert in residence at Georgetown University, focused specifically on my work with creator mental health and well-being, and I'm the proud mama of a newish book that came out April 2020, not a good time for a book to come out, called Wired This Way, which is about the mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being of creators. So I'm obviously very passionate about this work. I'm passionate about it because I've walked the journey. I'm still walking the journey. I have had over the years a lot of different labels slapped on me. I think the labels are less important than what I've come to learn about them, which is actually the brilliant and beautiful light qualities that come along with these things that we mostly view as dark. And so whether that's an eating disorder that I had in college or struggled with in college, or depressive tendencies or OCD-like tendencies. I mean, I've come to appreciate that it's all part of this really beautiful tapestry that is actually a great reflection of my strengths.
Wonderful, thank you. Thanks for joining. And Pothik, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Pothik Chatterjee. I'm the Executive Director for Innovation and Research at LifeBridge Health. We're based in Baltimore, Maryland, but we do a lot of work with DC-based startups, and I'm really excited to share some of our technology innovation collaborations with you. I actually went to Georgetown and spent, I think, almost a decade in DC. So this is almost like a nice homecoming for me. And thank you so much, Amira, for giving me a chance to share with the DC startup community. In terms of my personal journey with self-care, as a person of color, as an immigrant, as a member of the LGBTQ community, it's become a really important topic for me that I think about all the time, that I talk to my friends about, my family, my partner. Oftentimes in corporate settings, I'm the only non-white person in a boardroom, the only visibly gay person or openly gay person, and that can cause some stress and anxiety and microaggressions in some instances. So self-care is really important to me in my journey as well, evolving through my professional life and my personal life. And as someone from a South Asian background, mental health can be somewhat of a taboo topic. So it's really important for me to try to normalize, as a South Asian leader as well in America, this topic and encourage conversations about it.
That's great. Thanks, Pothik. So I'll share a bit about myself. My academic background is in organizational psychology, and since then I've spent my career internal and external assisting organizations with all things people related. So pretty much every problem you've had with a person in a workplace, I have helped to solve, whether that's a policy or a system or something interpersonal and a little bit messier. I have worked at Bridgewater Associates of Principles fame, if you've seen that book floating around. I worked at Booz Allen Hamilton, advising government and intelligence agencies, and McChrystal Group, team of teams is the philosophy that came out of that organization. And then most recently, about 3 years ago, started my own company. So I'm the founder and CEO of the Rivington Group, and I advise startups, usually small to medium companies, on growing their people operations and their people function and giving them that really strong foundation that companies of all sizes really need, but that usually you don't bring in until a little bit later in your maturity. And so I help them kind of get over that hump. I did spend a stint at Bink, a national tech recruiting company, as their chief people officer. So a lot of really interesting gigs, and really excited to be here speaking with you all today. This topic is very near and dear to my heart because as I was starting a chief people officer role and managing the Rivington Group on the side, my husband and I were hit by a drunk driver. We were in a rollover car accident, and I suffered a pretty severe traumatic brain injury. So I have gone in the past year from not being able to remember what folks are saying in front of me, needing to write down the topic of conversation so that I could engage in it, to now being able to moderate this panel. So it's been quite a journey, and sort of watching the brain heal, almost as a third party, kind of rediscovering your own brain and your own capability. Obviously, there are a lot of mental health components to that. So it has been really fascinating and very personal for me. So I'm excited to share in this with you. And you know, this topic is one that we bring into the workplace, whether we acknowledge it or not. So it's nice that we can kick off by normalizing this topic a bit, and it's nice that we can carve out a little bit of space. I'll turn it over to Amira so that we can all tend to our own mental health and care for ourselves for a moment here. So she's got a short meditation planned for us. So Amira, take it away.
All right, so for those of you, if you wanted to mute yourselves, speakers, you can, or you can keep yourselves unmuted, but just to create some peace here. So if you have your phone in front of you, I just invite you to put away your phone, sit in a position that's comfortable for you, that's relaxed and alert, where you feel like you can breathe easily. And if you're comfortable, close your eyes. Or if you keep them open, keep your gaze downward. Notice what you're feeling in your body. Notice if there are any tensions, any sensations grabbing your attention. Rest your attention there for a moment. Now, let's just take a few deep breaths. Notice the effect on your body. Now, with light attention, I invite you to scan your body, starting at the top of your head, using your attention as a laser beam, just to scan from the top of your head downward, noticing any itching or ache, heat or cold, your temples, your jaw, in your neck, and just let your attention continue downward over your shoulders and down through your arms. Notice the positions of your hands. Now let's continue down, checking in with your back. If there's any place that seems to grab your attention, just rest your attention there for a moment. Check in with your belly. It might be busy, it might be quiet, it might be numb. Notice any sensations at your hip level or at your legs where they meet the chair, and scan down your legs. Notice your feet. Now for a moment, take in your whole body as life is flowing through your body, through the vessels and the nerves, all the cells doing the work beyond your conscious mind. Maybe extend a moment of gratitude for all the work that's going on in your body, supporting and giving you life. When you're ready, feel free to open your eyes.
Thank you. Well, I'll welcome you all back. I feel my speech is even going to be a little slower and calmer now after that. That was lovely and much needed late in the afternoon. Thanks, Amira. Okay, so let's dive in. What I'd like to do to start is start by just defining some of these terms that we use so commonly and so casually, but that really have a lot of overlap. So two big ones that we're talking about today are mental health and self-care. And so what do we mean by those terms? And I'll just go right around, and Pothik, I'll start with you this time. Would you like to share with us how you would distinguish between those and how you would define those terms?
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. I'm not an expert by any means. When I think about self-care, I think about a host of different activities, rest, hobbies, that help you feel more balanced, more grounded, and more like yourself. It's the way that you kind of reward yourself for working really, really hard while you're at work, and it's the strategies that you put into place and implement in your life that can be really rewarding in your work as well as a leader, because it gives you that space to be more intentional and reflect and look inward. That's how I think about self-care. When you talk about mental health, there's a whole range of psychological and psychiatric conditions that should not be trivialized by any means. And so it's really important to keep that difference that I think Jessica will be talking a little bit more about as well. But at the same time, we shouldn't trivialize self-care. I think sometimes there is a position that it's a millennial fad and it's not really that important to adults, whoever adults are. But as I've grown in my life in my mid-30s adult, I found it to be increasingly important to have a self-care routine and a mental, well, I don't want to say mental health, but self-care routine that incorporates mental aspects and wellness in your life.
That's great. Jessica, what do you think?
Yeah, Pothik, you did a beautiful job distinguishing the two. So what I want to do is drill down a little bit deeper, specifically into mental health, because one thing that's been coming up for me a lot lately in my conversations, and because a lot of the, let's just say, branding around what I do is branded as mental health. But we should be very clear on what we mean when we say that, right? Because you can say that mental health is a state of mental well-being, or you could say that mental health is in reference to a clinically diagnosable mental health condition. And so I do think that the reason that there is confusion at best or stigma at worst around mental illness is because it's not always clear to people if I'm feeling low, or if I'm feeling stressed, or if I'm going through a period where I'm having, you know, the second or third or fourth cocktail at night. Does that mean I'm in a funk, or does that mean I have a mental illness? And so I want to quickly clarify that mental health or mental illness refers to things like depression, it refers to things like addiction, refers to things like OCD, bipolar. And then there are other sort of more what you might call low grade or subclinical or garden variety emotional, physical, and spiritual forms of distress or dysregulation we might experience. So what some of us are going through right now is we're feeling stressed. We're feeling a little anxious. We're feeling, you know, our routines and our habits are out of sort of their normal state. But that doesn't necessarily mean we're struggling with our mental health per se. So I'm just making that clarification to make clear that when you're talking to your team about mental health, that people may struggle with that term only because they may not have a diagnosable mental health condition. And so, you know, some terms that you can use are, you know, are things like emotional regulation or stress or burnout. But to be very clear that not everyone who's struggling with their emotions is necessarily has a diagnosable mental health condition.
That's a great point. And it's not just important because, you know, we don't want to trivialize mental health topics, but also as employers, as many of the folks on the call are, that distinction legally is going to be really important to them in terms of how they protect and support their employees. And we want to protect and support the entire spectrum of experience, but we're certainly held to a higher standard when it applies to mental health. So that's helpful to draw that distinction. So what I'd like to do for our discussion is talk about the individual level that we're all, I'm sure, experiencing in our own way right now, many of us struggling. We'll talk about the team level. So how do we bring this into our most intimate units in the workplace? And then at a more systemic level and societal level. So whether that's your organization or even more broadly about these topics. So let's start at that smallest unit at the individual level. And Jessica, your book, which is so beautifully written, Wired This Way, explores the connection between mental health and creativity, which is important in every organization. You know, as robots do more and more, and not that creative work, but more and more of the work that falls out of the creative sphere, we know creativity is just increasingly important in the workplace. So what advice do you have for individuals and leaders during this time when you know, our environment, our circumstances are presenting additional mental health challenges to an already to a population of creatives that already may be struggling or trying to balance.
Absolutely. Well, so two things. First is that, I love this question so much. So first and foremost, whether you're looking at mental illness or emotional dispositions or physical dispositions, such as like a disposition to a predisposition to stress-related illness, some of us are more physically sensitive than others. Any vulnerability or sensitivity you have is going to come hand in hand with a whole suite of light, bright qualities as well. And so very often we kind of look at it in the order of, okay, well, someone is artistic and they're depressed, but it's okay because they're artistic. It's like, instead we could look at it the other way, where it's like, okay, so if you look at someone with depression, you can choose to see someone who's capable of slowing their energy down, withdrawing from the world and thinking, like ruminating really complexly on a problem of their choosing. Or, you know, when we look at someone who's wired for addiction, we can choose to see someone who's wired for novelty seeking and sensation seeking and risk taking and passion and love and commitment. And so first, what I would suggest for people, for employers, if there are pathologies that are starting to bubble up in this time, to really meet that awareness with, okay, well, let's look at the other side of this coin. Let's look at how all of the qualities and the attributes that I've had across my lifespan that have been so celebrated and so praised are actually born from the same place that is now giving me this diagnosis. And I go through a lot more of that in my book. The other interesting way to look at it, I think is interesting, is to look at it from the perspective of, you know, pre-pandemic, pre-quarantine, we were in this period of brilliant lightness. And what I mean by that is it was very action oriented. We were all out there. We were doing. And we didn't all have a lot of time to really sit with ourselves and to turn over all of the stones inside of ourselves and to let things bubble up to the surface, for better or for worse, to really let the Pandora's box open. And what quarantine has introduced is really this period of darkness, in a sense, but darkness also being a period of fertility, a period of creativity, a period of archetypal femininity, right? Where all of this doing can actually settle. And then we can sort of find some new gems, so that when we come out of this period of crisis, that we can emerge back into action with this these personal insights that we found during this period of darkness. So I think that really looking at it as this contrast of light and dark, and neither being bad and neither being good, because frankly, I think a lot of us were burned out and pretty unhappy during the period of, you know, everyone being out and social and going to a million happy hours and so on and so forth. So there's a light and a dark to everything, and being willing to see that, I think, is huge.
Yeah, that's great. There's so many parts of normal that we've been talking about. Well, maybe we don't want to go back to that. You know, I've heard that said so many times. And
I want to go back to working in an office 5 times a week. Absolutely not.
Many don't. That's right. Yeah, and it's great the way you framed this, and that you know, the light and the dark, and really challenging yourself to look at some of the benefits of some of your more unique qualities, because that's where that creativity is going to come from, is that unique perspective. There are some great questions popping up too in the chat. I'm going to turn to Pothik now, but Jessica, there's one in here on creativity and the importance in areas that aren't stereotypically considered creative realms. So give a look to that. I'll turn it back to you in just a moment. But in the meantime, Pothik, you are working with LifeBridge Health, and you're helping healthcare startups really gain traction and get going and give them some boost. You're actually now launching an incubator, which is super exciting. So I was just so curious to hear from you. Are there startups that you've worked with that are helping individuals with wellness and self-care? And what are some of the really interesting innovations happening that you have had the pleasure of seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, LifeBridge Health, we are a hospital system with 5 hospitals and partnering facilities across the greater Baltimore area. And our innovation department serves as the front door for health technology startups that are trying to get their products into patient care and used by physicians. So we work with these startups to implement 6-month or 1-year pilots where we can test and validate the technology. These could be mobile apps, artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, sensors, wearables, anything really that helps improve patient outcomes, reduce the cost of care, and improve physician experience as well. And the incubator that you mentioned is in partnership with Care First Blue Cross Blue Shield of Maryland. And we're really excited because we'll be able to bring the provider and payer perspectives to help startups accelerate their growth. Because one of the major pitfalls that I've seen in the past is startups have a great technology, but they don't have clinicians wanting to use it because there's an existing use, or they haven't thought about the reimbursement model. And if you can't get paid, your startup is going to unfortunately go out of business. So we're hoping that this payer provider model will be really unique and offer great support and mentorship to early stage startups. In terms of examples of startups that we've been working with that touch on the wellness space, I want to mention one that's really unique. It's based out of Baltimore. It's called LiveChair. So this startup started as a reservation app for customers looking to make appointments with their barbers for haircuts. And they focused on African-American male patients in Baltimore. And you may be aware that there's a really unique culture and relationship between African-American men and their barber. They can talk about their life, their hobbies, their anxieties, their relationships. And what they found through this experience of this booking app is that a lot of the customers were actually talking about healthcare issues as well. So what they did is they introduced a blood pressure cuff so that they can measure their blood pressure in the barbershop and alert the customers about hypertension issues. So we have partnered with LiveChair so that if these customers need follow-up care with a primary care physician or a specialist, then we can provide that service to them. And African-American patients in general are at a higher risk for hypertension compared to the national American population. So that's one example of a partnership when we're actually providing some United States Small Business Administration grant funding to LiveChair. So the scope of that grant was to support minority and female entrepreneurs in the Baltimore, DC area. So that's one example that I wanted to share.
That is so incredible. It's amazing, the journey that startups take and the niche, the unique niches that they fill. What a great example. Thank you. So flipping back to you, Jessica, on these great comments that are coming through and these wonderful questions. One on industries that aren't typically considered creative, and another wonderful one coming in on that toxic positivity.
Yeah.
And as a yes. And you know, if you've ever been in a dark place, you know, that could just kind of grate on you. And also the shoulds of self-care. Isn't that just another way of us pressuring ourselves? So could you speak to those?
Yeah. And I'll try to touch on each briefly, but in terms of creativity in sort of non-creative fields, I mean, you know, I think the glossy, easy breezy answer is I think everyone's creative, and I think that creativity can be implemented anywhere. But what's interesting about creativity is that at a neurobiological level, creativity is associated with disinhibition, with basically feeling uninhibited. And back at the start of my career, I was working in a neuroscience lab at the National Institutes of Health, and we were actually doing brain studies on rappers, like music rappers, who need to be very creative, very improvisational. And what was actually found is that their frontal lobe, which is the part of our brain that says, don't do that, you'll sound dumb, you're going to embarrass yourself, is very uninhibited to the parts of their brain that's connected with their linguistic output. And so the reason I give that example, sort of tying creativity to mental health in maybe a more unusual way, is that really what it means to be creative in any field is to feel free, is to feel expressive, to feel safe in being your authentic self, to, really be uninhibited. That's also why we tend to get really creative after a glass of wine. It also tends to be why we're creative in environments when we feel safe or around people that we trust. And so I would say, allowing your team to feel really safe is going to naturally elevate their levels of creativity, because they feel that psychological safety from a mental health or well-being perspective. In terms of the toxic positivity, this is such a good question. You could call it toxic positivity, or lately I've been seeing a lot on Instagram about what's called like spiritual bypassing, which is kind of the same thing, where basically you kind of just say, oh, well, the universe wants it that way. And you kind of like write things off in that sense. And also a few things. First, I think that there's a lot of cotton candy out there when it comes to mental health and well-being and self-care. And I would invite anybody to give a nice little unfollow to, any accounts or any people or any sources that are just pushing that, frankly, I think, BS on you. However, ... what I would say is that from a psychological perspective, and Carl Rogers is like the go-to resource on this, that we grow when we feel accepted, that we can only change something about ourselves once we accept it. And so I think what toxic positivity, looking at it from an optimistic perspective, is trying to do is trying to make people accept things about themselves that they otherwise wouldn't want to. So if anything that I say comes across as toxic positivity, which it certainly might, I'm only doing so with the intention to help people accept the darker parts of themselves so that they can start integrating it.
Really, really important. If you've ever been in a culture that has that, it's really pushing that positivity. It can do damage to the organization. Really, if people are uncomfortable raising issues or problems, then how do you learn? How do you improve? So I've certainly experienced that and witnessed that. You also mentioned psychological safety. That's based on Amy Edmondson's amazing work. So to all of you out there who have heard this term, psychological safety, I encourage you to look into that. It's the factor that makes teams most effective, the single most important factor for team effectiveness, and not just creative teams, but in terms of collaboration as well. So really important concepts. So let's include a piece that I'm sure a lot of people were anticipating. Let's get our personal tips out there. So what are some practical things that individuals can do to care for themselves in order to bring their best selves to work? Pothik, I'll start with you.
Sure, I'll share just two of them briefly. The first one is something that I've started after the pandemic, which is a morning ritual, which I never used to do before. I would just get up and sleep in as much as possible, grab my coffee and drive to work. But now, since I don't have to commute necessarily every day, I have the privilege of having 30 or 40 minutes in the morning before my meetings to meditate. I use an app called Calm, which has daily 10-minute meditations. And this has been life-changing for me. It's really helped me reduce some of my anxiety and just connect with my breathing. And after I do the 10-minute meditation, I try to journal a little bit about my top goals for the day, just setting 2 or 3 goals, both about work, but also about my personal life, trying to get some exercise in, doing yoga, or I've taken on the new hobbies in the pandemic, like art classes. So I try to set aside time for that. And it's made a really big difference in the way that I then start my workday after that 30 or 40 minutes. I'm just less reactive and more thoughtful, I think, and I am able to kind of take on other people's issues and problems as I'm having conversations with them, and really have a richer, deeper relationship, which ultimately in business, technology, startup world, I think there's a lot that comes out of relationships. And if I'm coming into that conversation more calm and more intentional, then it's going to lead to better outcomes. The second kind of practical tip that I wanted to share with this group, I'm stealing it from Brene Brown. She has an amazing podcast called Unlocking Us, and I encourage everyone to listen to her. She has this amazing concept called FFTs, which stands for effin' first times. And it describes what we're all going through this pandemic collectively, with working from home, not traveling, social life has completely changed. So many schools are going online. Parents are having to deal with kids at home. You might have a family member, a partner who has COVID and is suffering, right? There's all these new experiences. And Brene Brown's recommendation is to talk about this FFT framework with your team or in your personal life as well. And it's to normalize that when something is happening for the first time, it's going to bring a lot more stress. And so you should try to put it in perspective with everything else that's happening, and have that discussion, and then do a reality check about what's really realistic in this pandemic world, right? The pace of which we're doing business at may have to slow down. The KPIs, the metrics that you're using in your business or even in our nonprofit world may need to be adjusted. So let's have a conversation around that. And I found it a really helpful kind of intellectual framework to share with my team.
That's great. I love that. I'm imagining all the 2020 strategies that were pretty much thrown out the window, and maybe some that need to be, so that they can be adjusted. Great point. Jessica, over to you. Any tips that you have?
Yeah, so two tips. The first one being not so much a tip as a, I guess, process recommendation. And that being, I mean, I could tell you until I'm blue in the face what my like routine and ritual is, but I think that one of the biggest, if not the biggest, journeys or parts of self-care is identifying your own constellation of stars, each star representing a different coach, therapist, teacher, healer, practice, therapy, app, book, whatever it is that works for you. And what my constellation looks like is going to be very different from yours. And so I think really I don't know who needs to hear this, but like if you're trying to, or you're being told that like one healer, one practice, or one this or one that, or 20 minutes a day of whatever thing is going to fix you or heal you or cure you, you can get over that right now because, we're all special snowflakes in that way. Second tip is I recommend what the philosopher Michael Foucault referred to as technologies of the self. So Foucault was a philosopher who wrote an essay. Basically, he believes that there are multiple kinds of technologies, technologies of production and signs. And then there are technologies of the self. And he defined technologies of the self as any tools or practices that can impart change on the mind, body, or spirit of the individual. And so then he went on to talk about throughout history for millennia, since the time of Socrates and Aristotle and the Stoics, all of the different technologies of self. So these can include things like meditation, breath work, dialogue, dream analysis, painting, songwriting. These are really, what's so beautiful, I think, about this conceptualization is that anything outside of you can be used as this like mirror. And the other cool thing about technologies of the self is that they're all things that can be basically done without paying another person. And I'm a big believer in working with a coach or a guide or a therapist, but I also would be totally lost at sea if I didn't have practices that I could do by myself consistently every day. And so I think I'm feeling really empowered in the fact that watercoloring while you're listening to classical music, that is therapy. Because it's teaching you something about yourself, through that practice, through that process, through painting something without any expectations and then seeing what colors show up, or listening to a song and really just sitting with the song and thinking about what feelings it's bringing up, that is you doing therapy on yourself.
That's great. I love these. And, you know, the one I'll share is just an anecdote, really. And all of the above to everything you all said, as through my brain injury recovery, you know, I've discovered the power of meditation and exercise, helping being out in nature, taking breaks. All of these things have been tremendously helpful and a huge part of my mental health hygiene. But my anecdote is that I had a colleague say, have you tried aromatherapy, after I was sharing with her some really difficult deficiencies that I'm struggling with? And I had to laugh, because I'm sure it is a little bit helpful, but the kinds of things that I was up against, certainly aromatherapy wasn't going to get me back to normal anytime soon. So humor is one takeaway from that anecdote, but also that some things happen to you and you don't control everything. And sometimes that's your own brain chemistry, and sometimes that's you know, a pandemic or your environment. So realizing that you don't have control in every situation, acknowledging that maybe you just need a break, you're in a bad spot, and that this too shall pass. So that's my one tidbit. Okay, so let's take it a level higher, and let's talk about the organization level, and even more systemically, if you're inspired to do so. How can employers help support individuals and teams? Pothik, what do you think?
Yeah, it's challenging given all of the, you know, emotional and social pressures that employees are facing. You know, there's HR, there's employee resources that many large organizations provide, which some startups may not even be able to do. And I was trying to think about, you know, ways that LifeBridge has gone above and beyond during this time. We recently had a virtual wellness fair where we offered education to our employees around mental health and a variety of physical health issues as well, like colon cancer. Chadwick Boseman recently passed away in his early 40s. So it's important to educate our employees about health conditions and checkups. So that's just one example. We also have an app that we provide to our employees for free called Share Care. This was founded by Dr. Oz back in 2010. And this offers a number of incentives. So employees can get paid, for example, if they take a survey where you can answer a number of questions, and it will tell you your real age versus your biological age based on your diet and your exercise and your health history. They also encourage you to join teams within your organization and do fitness activities and get your flu shot as well. So if you do all three of these, you get some type of incentive. But you know, taking your question even to a broader level, how do organizations address vulnerabilities and inequalities in our society that have come to light in 2020? I do want to share one example where LifeBridge put together mobile clinics to go out to West Baltimore and provide COVID testing in the homes of patients who may not be able to afford transportation to drive to a COVID testing site. We also gave those nurses and social workers iPads so they could do virtual visits from the comfort of the patient's home. I think we as an industry and as a nation and society need to think more about these vulnerable populations. We need to go beyond individualism and purely profit into collective needs and collective balance. There needs to be a bit more of a balance. And I think in Asia, there's more of that importance about the collective. And in America, it's more about the individual. And maybe there needs to be a little bit more balance.
I couldn't agree more. In this moment. It has really laid bare some of the less positive parts of our super individualistic society. So yes, the pendulum, I think most would agree, needs to swing a bit in the other direction. you also raise a really interesting question around how much can and should employers do, because these are amazing benefits that you are citing here. So for everyone listening, every bit helps. And I know that resources are often a constraint, but even what I noticed as a chief people officer was just even making an effort often goes a really long way in getting people to care for themselves a bit more. And Jessica, you've done some research around periods of quarantine and isolation, and you shared with us earlier a little bit of a prediction on maybe a silver lining around this. So could you share that with the rest of the group?
Yeah, so basically back at the beginning of quarantine, when I was trying to calm myself down, I did some research on what, historically speaking, has happened during and after times of quarantine, times of isolation, times of crisis. What I found was super consistent, and I don't think I'm the first person to like ever have this epiphany, but I'll share it anyway, which is that, so take the Black Death, for example, the bubonic plague. That was shortly followed by the Renaissance, a period of incredible creativity and productivity. Isaac Newton, when he was actually quarantined at his parents' country home outside of London, it was during those, I think it was 2 years that he was quarantined, came up with his theories of relativity and, relativity, excuse me, gravity. That's the other smart guy. Gravity and, did I say Isaac Newton? If I said Thomas Edison, I meant to say Isaac Newton. Anyway, sorry, it's the end of the day, but there are countless examples, including the Spanish flu, which is the most recent example of the Spanish flu being shortly followed by the Harlem Renaissance. And so all of these examples of basically crisis, a period of darkness, being followed by rebirth, by renewal. And what I love so much about that is that it really mimics the lessons that nature teaches us, right? Where that's about seasons, it's about death and rebirth, it's about the symbolism of the Ouroboros, the snake or serpent eating its own tail, which is like giving birth to oneself, and that through this muddiness, it's also like that saying, no mud, no lotus, right? Through this muddiness, we can actually emerge with personal clarification on what we want to create, how we want to create it, how we want to show up in the world. I mean, I'm going to be very, very curious the trends in personal growth and development that happen as a result of this really year of navel gazing, essentially. I mean, that is hellish at times, but is also wildly productive at others.
That'll be very exciting to see. Yeah, this moment of quiet, what's going to spring from this. All right, let's wrap up by turning to some of these questions that have been accumulating in the chat. And Amira, I know you've probably done a much better job than I have at keeping track of them and drawing some of them out. But I'll start with this one from you yourself, or from someone that you've captured. How can we normalize talking about mental health in the workplace to our managers, to our employees? And Pothik, you've got a good start going here talking about PTO. Could you expand on that?
We, in America, there's such a culture of not taking PTO compared to Europe, for example, where I think in parts of Europe, they take the entire month of August off. I was inspired by that because I was feeling a little bit burnt out by July after the first 3 months of the pandemic, working in a health system, supporting our doctors and our administrators and our nurses. And I took this kind of mental approach of taking a couple of Fridays off and trying to reduce my workload, but having that conversation with your team, with your boss, with even people 2 levels below can be really a productive and helpful way to have that conversation, because even if people aren't traveling for vacations, they can still do a staycation. They can still spend time with their families, with their partners, and do local hiking activities, for example. But it's hard to normalize this conversation. So that's just one example. But I think in your one-on-ones with your reports, you can talk about not just the projects that they're working on, but how are they feeling professionally? Are they feeling fulfilled? Are there gaps? And you have to be respectful too. Not everyone is comfortable talking about their personal life or their mental health. So you have to be gentle and see how they respond to some general questions and then dive deeper if they're interested.
That's great. And if you have questions, go ahead and throw those in the chat so that we can get to them. I'm seeing one a little bit further up. Any thoughts about healthy diet, for example, reducing sugar for productivity? Anything around that, Jessica, that you can offer?
Yeah, so I'm gonna take that question and spin it a little bit because I mean, yeah, I could say eat your greens, eat your vegetables. But as someone who has personally experienced and also witnessed the outcomes of disordered eating, which I actually am certain is tremendously common on a spectrum in today's society that's obsessed with doing everything to extremes, that I'm not for prescribing any super extreme regimen, whether that's cutting out sugar, cutting out this, that, the other thing. What I would say related to this question is creative individuals very often tend to be empaths. And for those who are unaware, empaths are individuals who go beyond just being empathetic, but are truly empathic. They feel what other people are feeling. They're very intuitive. They're very sensitive to their environments. And this is something that, you know, there are books written by doctors on empaths. And basically what it is a nervous system, systemic sensitivity to your environment. So as a mega empath myself, what I will say is that the beautiful part of being an empath is this you know, you're perceiving everything and receiving everything and noticing everything. And, you know, I can have one glass of wine and be perfectly happy. You know, everything affects me very strongly. The downside of that, and I'm coming back to this question about sugar, the downside of that is that things can feel, even normal amounts of stimulation can feel like a lot. So whether that's the people that you're around, or the music, or the stimulation, or the crowded co-working space, or the fact that artificial smells just drive you bonkers, or alcohol, sugar, caffeine, anything that is a stimulant, a depressant, or otherwise harassing your nervous system is going to be very, very difficult for empaths. So what I would say is, I don't think you need to cut sugar out. I certainly don't, because I have a huge sweet tooth. But just be super mindful about the way that your sweet sensitive system is taking it on, and just to start that sort of regulation conversation with yourself.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Amira, you had a question about mental health and mental illness specifically.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's been top of mind for me, and that has been a huge part of the national conversation around work, is how do we actually speak up about mental illness in the workplace? Like, it's very normal. Like, I love, Pothik, your tip about take PTO. I'm with you. You know, and Pothik and I both grew up overseas where it was much more normal, right? It wasn't, PTO is a very American term. Like, taking vacation is a lot more normal overseas. But like, having a real mental health day, or being able to tell your manager, you know, my anxiety is in high gear, or I'm on anxiety medication. These are not conversations that are yet really normal in the workplace. And I'm curious what strategies you might have for people who are on this call, who are either experiencing this, right? Like this struggle or this tension between their own life experience and their experience at work, and their ability to navigate the two identities. How can they bridge that? How can they begin to create that psychological safety and space as an employee, right? Because they're not often the more powerful person in that power dynamic. So I would love your ideas, any ideas you have, both from being leaders inside your workplaces and also having been employees.
So many angles to that. Pothik, Jessica, either of you want to take a stab?
Yeah, I'll try taking a stab. I agree with you. It's very challenging because you don't want to be viewed as weak or more vulnerable, even though we know from Brene Brown that vulnerability is actually a strength. The reality is we all work in competitive work situations where you don't want to be the team member who took 5 days off for mental health reasons and everyone else is progressing on this project super well and you're left behind. I think you have to be strategic, tactical, right? Time it maybe after a major deliverable has finished and there is, like, it makes logical sense to take some time off because you had a major accomplishment, and there's, you know, I think employers are reasonable, right? That's one thing, like, be strategic about your timing. Another thing that I would encourage is try to have that conversation with your manager. I've been pleasantly surprised that when I've opened up about my stress or my anxieties about work-related projects having an impact on me, keeping me up sleepless nights when we were trying to get that PPE factory set up so we can have masks for all of our doctors and nurses and employees. I had sleepless nights and I was waking up in the middle of the night. What if we can't do this? What if people got COVID because we couldn't get the masks and gowns? Just try to have that conversation with your manager, like maybe connect it to work somehow, see how they respond. And then if they are open and they're sharing their own vulnerabilities and their own family stresses, you would be surprised what people are dealing with. Then maybe that gives you some safe space to open up about things that are not connected to work.
Yeah, so helpful.
That was
go
such
ahead.
good advice.
Yeah, we're in our last minute, so I don't want to cut you off, Jessica. But go ahead if you have a Oh, and here we are at 5. So
I love
scheduling
your breakdowns. I was just going to say, yeah, to your point, create resonance, right? Like create resonance between you and your higher up boss before the breakdown happens. Resonance meaning like open that line of communication so that you know, when the time does come to maybe share a little bit more than you're comfortable with, just delay it until it's convenient. Yeah, totally. Then, you know, you already have that pre-established comfort with each other.
That's awesome. Well, obviously we could have talked much longer on this topic. Amira, any last comments or thoughts before we drop?
Yeah, thank you all so much. Pothik, Jessica, and Rachel, you have been incredible. You've shared really thoughtful ideas around this topic, as well as really practical advice for every single person here that they can take back to their own lives and their own teams. And I hope that every person who's with us here really is intentional and thoughtful about how you take care of yourself for your own well-being, but also to enable you to take care of other people you work with, who live with you, who are impacted by you. As much as we take care of ourselves, we take care of the people around us. For those of you who want to reach out to our speakers, who want to recap, who want links to all the recommendations that were shared today, I will share the link with you one more time. Go ahead and download the full guide at manifesta.co/startupweek. Also, just as a final note, we have one last session in the culture track. It's tomorrow at 10 a.m. It's called the CEO's New Framework on Employee Engagement, Retention, and Culture. And I will be moderating a session with a CEO, a CHRO, and a diversity and inclusion expert. It's going to be amazing. So join us at 10. And for now, thank you again so much, Rachel, for facilitating this incredible conversation. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Pothik. You're all amazing. I'm super grateful to you. Thanks to our audience. Have a wonderful evening.